The first sign wasn't the crash. It wasn't the headlines screaming about billions wiped out, or the photographs of traders with their hands buried in their hair. It began quietly, like a storm rehearsing behind the clouds long before the thunder arrived. A farmer in Oklahoma staring at soil that refused to give life. A factory worker in Detroit noticed the orders slowing down. A banker in New York whispering about loans that suddenly felt heavier than the ledgers they were written in. Then one ordinary October morning in 1929, the nation woke up to a shiver in the air. Nobody understood it yet, but something was coming. Something vast. Something merciless. On Wall Street, men gathered in crisp suits, believing the last decade had rewritten the laws of reality. For years, fortunes had grown like weeds. Stocks climbed for no reason other than the belief they would keep climbing. Everyone felt invincible. Housewives, teachers, mechanics, barbers. People who had never touched a stock before were suddenly traders, convinced the party could never end. Even taxi drivers boasted about the shares they owned. But beneath that glittering confidence, panic had been chewing its way through the foundation. Prices wobbling, borrowed money stacking like dynamite. And when the first spark hit, the explosion tore the country open. Traders rushed onto the floor, shouting, sweating, fighting for air as numbers on the ticker tape dropped so fast they blurred. Phones slammed. Papers filled the air like snow. Men who had woken up wealthy found themselves ruined before lunch. And the terrifying thing was that the fall didn't stop with them. It spread like a wave sweeping across the nation, swallowing factories, swallowing farms, swallowing every dream Americans had been taught to believe in. In small towns, fathers sat at kitchen tables staring at bills they could no longer pay. Children felt the tension before they understood it. Mothers whispered to neighbors about husbands who hadn't come home from the city. In New York, some men jumped from windows, unable to face the collapse of their worlds. The newspapers printed their names, but never their stories. Those were left for their families to carry in silence. The banks tried to pretend everything was fine. They stood tall, smiled wide, and insisted the storm would pass. But as people lined up outside their doors demanding the money they had trusted them with, the truth became impossible to hide. Vaults emptied. Doors locked. Savings vanished. Some banks closed overnight, leaving thousands with nothing but a note on the window explaining how sorry they were. And the panic spread farther. Factories shut down when no one could afford the goods they produced. Men who had never missed a day of work found themselves standing in lines that stretched for blocks, waiting for soup, waiting for bread, waiting for dignity that slipped further away each day. In the Midwest, dust storms rose like towering black walls, swallowing homes, cattle, entire farms. Mothers stuffed wet towels into window cracks trying to keep their babies from breathing in the dirt. Hope, America's loudest, most dependable promise, grew quiet. People held their breath and wondered how the richest country in the world could crumble this quickly, this brutally. But then, somewhere in that darkness, voices began to rise. Not leaders, not politicians, ordinary Americans. Farmers helping neighbors harvest dying crops. Families moving in together to survive. Strangers sharing what little food they had. On the radio, a new kind of message started drifting through the airwaves, telling people they weren't alone, that the nation had fallen before and would rise again. And slowly, through that collective heartbreak, a new story began to take shape. One of grit, one of community, one of a people who refused to vanish with the dust. But survival was never simple. The winter after the crash cut through the country like a blade, exposing every weakness the economy had hidden behind its glitter. In Chicago, men wrapped newspapers around their bodies because coats were too expensive. In Pittsburgh, factory chimneys that had roared endlessly fell silent, their smokestacks standing like gravestones against a gray sky. And in New York, once the heartbeat of roaring prosperity, entire families huddled together under bridges in makeshift shelters made of cardboard and tin. Hoovervilles, they called them, Towns built from scraps, from shame, from the remains of the American dream. Children played in the mud because toys were a luxury now. Men wandered the streets each morning pretending they still had a job to go to. Mothers learned to stretch one potato into a meal for 5. And yet, even in their suffering, people found ways to laugh, if only to stop themselves from breaking. Every newspaper headline told the same story: record unemployment, failing farms, falling prices, and every person had their own version of that story carved into their lives. A barber who cut hair for food instead of money. A teacher who taught without pay because the school had no funds, but the children still needed to learn. A proud father who walked 10 miles to a job interview only to be told the position had been filled an hour earlier by someone who had walked 20. And still the dust came. The storms grew so massive they turned midday into night. Black clouds rolled toward homes like living monsters. People tied ropes from their houses to their barns so they wouldn't lose themselves in the swirling darkness. Some never made it back inside. Cattle suffocated where they stood. Crops disintegrated in farmers' hands. The wind carried away futures one grain at a time. Families loaded everything they owned onto rattling trucks and headed west in search of something. Work, hope, anything. Route 66 became a river of exhausted humanity stretching toward California. But what they found was not paradise. It was endless labor for pennies, fields that broke their backs, landlords who saw them as expendable, and signs that read no jobs for Okies. Yet somehow, through hunger, dust, humiliation, and fear, Americans kept going. They held on to every scrap of strength because stopping was not an option. Some nights, music drifted through the camps. An old guitar, a cracked harmonica, voices too tired to sing but singing anyway. Those songs turned into a lifeline. They reminded people that even if life had collapsed, they had not. Meanwhile, in Washington, the pressure mounted. President Hoover insisted recovery was just around the corner, but the people felt no such corner. They saw empty stomachs, empty pockets, empty promises. Eventually, the frustration grew too loud to ignore. Veterans, men who had risked their lives for their country, marched to the Capitol demanding the bonus they had been promised years earlier. They camped in the heat, waited for justice, and were met with tear gas, bayonets, and fire. The nation watched in disbelief as its own heroes were driven out by its own army. Something in the American spirit cracked that day. And cracks, when ignored, become fractures. Election season arrived carrying a kind of desperation the country had never felt before. People weren't voting for politics anymore. They were voting for survival. They weren't asking for change. They were begging for it. And in the midst of that exhaustion, one voice rose above the hopelessness: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He spoke with warmth, with confidence, with a belief that felt contagious. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he said, and Americans clung to those words like a rope thrown into stormy waters, because fear had been ruling their lives for far too long. And when Roosevelt stepped into office, something shifted, not in the numbers, not in the economy, not overnight, but in the spirit of the people. For the first time in years, Americans felt like someone was finally looking them in the eye instead of over their heads. The radio crackled with his voice each week, entering living rooms like a calm friend who refused to let fear dictate the conversation. He called them fireside chats, but they felt more like lifelines. Families gathered close around the speaker, listening as if warmth itself was pouring from the wires. Roosevelt didn't promise miracles. He promised action. And action was exactly what the country had been starving for. Work camps opened. Men who had been wandering for months found themselves with shovels in their hands, carving new roads through mountains and planting millions of trees across barren land. The hum of construction began filling the air. Bridges rising, dams forming, cities pulsing with activity again. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't easy, but it meant something. It meant America had stopped sinking and started rebuilding. In small towns, hope grew quietly. A shop reopened. A neighbor found a job. A mother bought bread without fear of tomorrow. The victories were small, pocket-sized, fragile, but they were victories nonetheless. But the Depression didn't end quickly. It clung to the nation like a shadow that refused to lift. Even as programs rolled out, even as jobs reappeared, even as music floated across dance halls again, there were still families living three to a room, still farms gasping for rain, still banks that never reopened. Yet something essential had returned. The belief that tomorrow could be different from today. People told their stories differently now. Instead of whispering fears, they shared possibilities. Instead of counting losses, they counted steps forward, however tiny. Communities rebuilt each other from the inside out. Strangers helped strangers. Churches fed the hungry. The desperate found comfort in the fact that someone, somewhere, understood their struggle. And then came the moment when the country realized something profound. The Depression had changed America not just economically, but spiritually. It had stripped away illusions of endless prosperity. It had taught the nation what endurance truly meant. It had revealed what mattered most when everything else was gone. By the late 1930s, the gears of industry slowly began turning with more confidence. The dust storms eased. Factories returned to life. A new generation stepped forward, ready to reshape the future their parents had nearly lost. The scars remained, etched into the land, etched into memory. But scars are proof of survival, not defeat. Families who had once stood in breadlines told their children about the nights they went to bed hungry and the mornings they woke up anyway. The parents who had carried shame for losing everything began to understand they had been part of something far larger. A trial by fire that tested the soul of the entire nation. And despite the suffering, despite the years stolen, despite the dreams shattered, America endured. The Great Depression didn't just end. It transformed. It forged a new sense of resilience, a new relationship with government, a new definition of community. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded a country built on ambition that strength is not measured in the highs of prosperity, but in the lows of heartbreak. By the time the shadow finally passed, America was not the same place that had danced through the roaring 20s. It was quieter, wiser, more aware of how fragile life could be and how powerful unity truly was. And though decades have passed and the world has changed, the echoes of that story still remain, reminding us that even when everything collapses, even when the ground disappears beneath our feet, the human spirit does not fade. It fights, it adapts, it rises. Just as it did then.